everyone. I'm Lauren, the founder. I wanted to say hi to everyone. Our MC is actually the one who's introducing this. Hey, Sep. Sep is from Microsoft. We love him. He's got so much experience. He's done this before, and actually he's a lot more fun than I am. So Sep, go for it. Talk to you guys at the end.
And apologies if you can hear, I have a little bit of grumbling dogs in the background. So apologies if you can hear them fighting. It's the end of the day, they want to go outside. So welcome attendees to our fun and absorbing Disruptive Techs event. My name is Sep DeMeglio, as Lauren said, and I'm the Disruptive Technologists MC and Microsoft's UC and Accessibility Engineer. And this is our 1 hour casual discussion, which will be recorded and posted on the Disruptive Technologies YouTube channel. Very typical. This will be followed up next week by an attendee Q&A. Today, we're also giving away 3 free 2-day passes to Upflex, a fabulous global office space, on-demand workspaces that set your teams free, and 3 beautiful futuristic books by Rebecca Costa, including On the Verge. To enter that lottery, just email your name, title, and company and email address to info@disruptivetechnologists.com or to organizer at the Disruptive Technologists NYC meetup. We'd like to very quickly thank our friends and supporters who've been with Disruptive Tech for the last several years. Although we aren't together in person quite yet, we want to show them our thanks. So thanks to Microsoft Reactors. Those are neighborhood campuses where developer and startup communities meet, learn, and connect. Thanks to Ramona Wright for supporting our podcasting program. Thanks to Esther Dyson for supporting our newsletter program. Thanks to Scott Moss for helping us upgrade our website. Thanks to Zeotag, the interactive video services. And finally, thanks to Disruptive Technologists Chairman David Soren. Looking forward to be able to meet again in person soon. And now I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Ivy Cohen of Ivy Cohen Communications. Ivy, you can take it away.
Thank you, Sep. It's great to see everybody here, however virtual. You know, Sep said this was going to be really fun, and I've been scratching my brain for some quantum computing humor, and I'm really struggling. If we were really going to do this in the spirit of quantum computing, this will be the fastest event you've ever experienced, and we'd be saying goodnight right now. So with that in mind, we're going to introduce our 4 fabulous panelists. First, we have Mark Mattingley-Scott. He's a Disruptive Technologists Board Member and a former IBM Quantum Computing Architect for 30 years, who just started his exciting new job as GM for EMEA for Quantum Brilliance. Mark's going to talk about his story and the innovative new challenges he's taking on. Next, we have Petra Soderling, who has run teams and innovation projects at Nokia Finland. She's the founder and has managed 2 startup companies in New York City and a startup in New Orleans. And her work has been in areas of developing businesses around mobile apps and real estate 3D and some other things we'll hear about today, obviously in the quantum world. Most recently, Petra's worked as a senior advisor for the Finnish government's innovation funding agency, Business Finland, as an advisor to the Finnish government on quantum computing, space technology, smart mobility, AI, and cybersecurity. And Petra lives and works in Colorado. Danica Hannon, our 3rd panelist, is a leader of the Minnesota Quantum Computing Meetup. Danica served on the Women in Quantum Advisory Board, volunteered for a quantum computing company and AI startup called Boltz AI, and became a relationship manager with Cambridge Quantum Computing, as well as the deputy head and IQSD chair for the Quantum Strategy Institute. Our 4th panelist, Frank Levine. Am I pronouncing it correctly, Frank?
It's Levine or Lavinia.
Lavinia.
I've been called a lot of bad things, so as long as it's not a bad thing.
Lavinia works. We should get it right. Thank you. Frank's a published author, a podcaster, and a conference speaker who's discovered the near limitless potential of quantum computing at a Microsoft research conference in 2019. In 2020, he shared his enthusiasm. In 2020, he launched the Impact Quantum podcast to share his enthusiasm for quantum technologies with fellow data scientists and engineers. In 2021, Frank left Microsoft to join Coverse, a platform that enhances security solutions for highly sensitive data, big data implementations. So That's a lot of information that compresses big careers with big ideas and a lot of serious technology. Let's get down to the quantum computing. To start off, I'd love it if all 4 panelists could take turns weighing in a minute or so about the quantum computing project you are currently working with or are most excited about. Mark, why don't you start us off?
Okay, so I've been giving some thought to this, and thank you for inviting me. First of all, I think the challenge of, or one of the big challenges of quantum computing is how do we make it actually make a difference? We see large superconducting quantum computers which look very beautiful and may one day actually provide some acceleration, some speed up, some computational benefit. I think the key question there, though, is what's stopping us, or what's going to enable us to really bring quantum computing into everyday use. And that's something I'm working on at Quantum Brilliance. And basically, it's about getting quantum computers to run at room temperature. And I think if I imagine the parallels with something like the development of silicon technologies, I think in maybe 40, 50, 60 years, when we look back, I probably won't be around, but my kids and my grandchildren look back, they'll say, okay, that was the moment where quantum computing suddenly got very, very real. And I think we're on the cusp of that right now.
Great, and we'll hear more from you about that over the course of this discussion. Petra, want to weigh in?
So I'm new to quantum computing. I've looked into this space for about 18 months now, and the trigger was my native country, Finland, investing in a quantum computer and starting to build a superconducting quantum computer. And I was thinking, wow, what is that? And I started to look into this. Now, privately, I've also launched a podcast. It's not on quantum computing, but it's on how government funding affects and creates new industries. And quantum computing is a prime example of an industry that would not exist if it wasn't for government funding. So I'm most passionate about looking into the streams of money right now, where they are coming from, where they're going, who's paying for what.
Sure. Frank, what are you working on or most excited about right now in quantum?
So I would say I'm most excited about, I think I will echo what Mark said. I think we are at that Fairchild semiconductor kind of age, or the invention of the transistor kind of age with quantum. And I will geek out with anyone who's willing to listen about quantum computing. And, primarily my background is software engineering and artificial intelligence. So I am just trying to teach myself how to write these new quantum algorithms and how to teach others, because I think there's going to be pardon the expression, a quantum shift in the career space, because I think it's going to be one of those, once we kind of get the hardware thing figured out, we're suddenly going to realize, oh, you know what? We don't have a lot of engineers that can write on these systems, and let alone integrate them into the enterprise. I think there's going to be an enormous opportunity there.
That's a really good handoff to Danica.
Thank you so much, Ivy. There are a couple of things that I'm really excited about. So the first is with the work that we're doing at the Quantum Strategy Institute and the focus that we're bringing to businesses. And we're starting to see some new players reach out to us and respond to our LinkedIn posts. And we're starting to reach a new audience and broaden the ecosystem, which is really exciting. So as we think about the adoption drivers that Mark was talking about, as the government funding that Petra was talking about that's helping expand this, and as Frank was talking about the upcoming career shift, with the Quantum Strategy Institute, it's just been wonderful to start to see the ecosystem expand and to see this groundswell of new players coming into space.
Great. And we'll talk about that some more as well. Mark, could you tell us how we can delineate what it means to make something quantum? Let's level set here.
Yeah, sure. So I think the most important aspect is to understand what quantum potentially offers. What is this computational speed up that everybody's talking about? And probably the most iconic and prototypical example of that is a quantum algorithm that was discovered by a professor at MIT, Peter Shaw, back in the 90s. And he basically, he took a problem which is computationally very, very hard on a classical computer. So finding the factors of a number, and found a quantum algorithm to speed that up, what we call exponentially. Give you a feel for that. If you want to factor a 2000-bit number, even using the biggest supercomputer on the planet, this will take billions of CPU years. It's infeasible, and that's the basis of pretty well all cryptography. When you buy something online, the cryptographic keys that are exchanged to enable you to make a secure payment are all based on the infeasibility of factoring large numbers. With Peter Shaw's algorithm and an adequate number of qubits, such a factoring of a 2000-bit number would be possible perhaps in hours or days, maybe minutes on a suitably powerful quantum computer. And that's the difference between a classic solution to a problem and a quantum solution to a problem. It's the difference between billions of years on the biggest supercomputer, and it doesn't really matter if it's days or weeks. It's the difference is simply unimaginable. You can't extend that kind of speed up to every problem that runs on a quantum computer, but that sets a kind of benchmark. And a lot of what's happening in the quantum computing space is focused either on developing new hardware, new types of qubits, or developing such algorithms like Peter Shaw's algorithm to solve other kinds of problems. So there are two different aspects, the hardware and the software, and what underlying it all is this this potential for incredible speed up.
Petra, can you talk to us a little bit about how different countries around the world are publicly funding quantum research and why public funding versus private funding?
Yes, I'm going to start with the public because there's so much money going on in both streams, public and private. But if we start from close to home, US Congress approved the National Quantum Initiative Act 2018 and allocated $1.2 billion to quantum computing research in this country. $1.2 billion, that's a huge, huge sum of money. But hear me out. Around the same time, Germany allocated 2 billion euros. So US 1.2, Germany 2 billion. India has allocated about the same amount of money as the US. Netherlands, a tiny country on the map, just like a tiny spot, you can't even see it on the map. They have allocated half of the money that the US government has allocated. And then of course there's China. They've said they are going to invest 10 billion US dollars. Now, all of this money is going to be allocated over a certain number of years, typically 5 to 7 years. So we're not comparing apples to apples here, but it gives an indication to which are the countries who are currently putting taxpayer money into quantum computing research and what are the quantities. So the fact that China is outspending, or they're saying they're outspending the US by a factor of 10 is quite interesting. But there are other surprises like India, who would have thought that India is going to put so much of their taxpayers' money into this. And I should mention Finland's 20 million euros into our tiny computer as well. But then if you look at the government funding and what's happening in these countries, there's a stark difference between the US and the rest of the world in terms of private money. So what the US is doing with the public money is very quickly and efficiently turning that into commercial action. So a year ago, the US triggered about half of this 1.2 billion, 600 some million into 5 different national labs that are now doing the quantum information services and quantum internet, which you can imagine is for national security interests is very interesting. But private companies, there was IBM, Microsoft, Lockheed Martin, put in 300 million. So 600 from the government, 300 from the private. And this is unique to the US. Europe and Asia are not doing it this way. I'm going to stop here and let others comment.
Anyone else?
Just to make a comment about something you just said. So you mentioned Finland and what appears to be a small amount of money for Finland, but that's highly leveraged money. And Finland has a incredible track record in low temperature physics, low temperature operations. And when I was back at IBM, I had a team in Finland, and they always told me, you know, when the anecdote about the Finnish army putting on their winter clothing when the temperature drops below -20. So there's no better place on earth to work on cold temperature, low temperature physics. But you do have, Finland does have an amazing skill set there. I think in terms of where is the race going to be run, yes, the US is investing a lot. It's able to leverage that with venture capital. But my analysis and my experiences have told me that the underlying technology, the place on earth where that's really the most dense in terms of universities doing research, potential customers, is the European Union. And the one other thing you mentioned about India, that is a very, very, very foresighted decision by India to invest in quantum computing, because it's also pretty clear that probably ultimately the majority of the quantum computing programmers will come from India. There is a huge, huge pool of software development talent in India. So quantum computing programming is essential for the Indian economy.
Now we're going to have Frank give us some examples of how quantum computing can affect different industries and uses. Before we do that, Mark, I'd appreciate it if you could talk a little bit more about, or really introduce, where are we going to see quantum computing being used to solve real problems? A lot of our audience members want to understand the potential.
Okay, so I'll keep it short. The original impetus to develop quantum computers came from the realization that you could use what we call a qubit, which is a simple quantum mechanical system, to simulate any other quantum mechanical system. That sounds very abstract. What that means in practice is, if you have some qubits, you can use them to simulate molecules. You can use them to simulate the behavior of atoms. You can use them to simulate materials, pharmaceuticals, drugs, everything. You can't do that right now. So these are things that will become possible with quantum computers. So that's the first type of problem. The second type of problem is a whole class, a whole set of problems around machine learning and artificial intelligence. Because spurred on or initiated by the work that Peter Shaw did, there's a whole set of, let's say, possibilities to accelerate a lot of different things in what's called linear algebra. And linear algebra lies at the root of a lot of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning things. The third area is around optimization. And this is probably long-term, the thing that's going to have the biggest impact. The fact that we're sitting here in a Zoom call and the packets are, whizzing backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, that's all being optimized. Where the packets go, that's all being observed and optimized on the fly. If you walk around Manhattan with a mobile telephone, if you order something online and it gets delivered to your house, there's a whole infrastructure which is using optimization. Optimization means we get food every day. It means we get fresh water, electricity. It means that when you flush the toilet, it works. It's everywhere, and quantum computing will change the way we optimize things. The potential long-term effect on society is I'm completely blown away by what that might mean.
And so with that in mind, Frank, maybe we could start with one or two examples. I understand you can talk to us a little bit about how the nitrogen cycle can improve energy efficiency and how we can improve the world's energy use dramatically with quantum computing.
Absolutely. And I actually just was at the Association of the U.S. Army conference in DC. And what was interesting was the interest in quantum computing in regards to Shor's algorithm, which would break encryption. So there's definitely a lot of interest in that space, but it's not just about encryption. One of the things we can't do with classical computing is simulate molecules, right? So one example, nitrogen fixation. Every plant that's out there can do two things really well that we really kind of struggle with. One is effectively pull nitrogen from the air and use it. What we do today is we create nitrogen fertilizer, which consumes a lot of energy. Depending on whom you ask, it's somewhere between 3 to 5% or 25% of the world's energy and carbon emissions kind of come out of that. So just right off the bat, if that problem is solved, just the nitrogen cycle, a significant amount of carbon reduction could be reduced in the atmosphere almost right away. Another aspect would be solar panel efficiency. Solar panels are approximately 20 to 30% efficient, meaning that they only capture that much energy from the sun. Potentially, chlorophyll plants, every green thing you see out there, basically can capture it anywhere from 40 to 60% efficiency. So right off the bat, those are two issues. And thirdly, battery technology, right? Everyone who has a smartphone, right? What do they carry around now? They carry around a little extra battery pack. Why is that? Well, it's because we're still working with battery technology that hasn't really seen any major advancements in quite some time. Now, there are some potential technologies on the horizon, but batteries power everything. Again, at this conference, you saw kind of the usual suspects of tanks and kind of things like that. But what was surprising was the amount of battery vendors there and battery technology vendors, kind of, because as we get into these Internet of Things and kind of more cyber-based, militarization, the technology, digital transformation, battery technology still has a way to go.
So Danica, thanks a lot, Frank. Danica, can you talk to us a little bit about how business leaders can or should start preparing for the disruptions that quantum computing will bring? And when do we really need to be prepared? Because based on what we've heard so far, it sounds like some of this is pretty far into the future.
Yeah, absolutely, Ivy. So that's a fantastic question. So I'm going to answer the second part of that first, of when do you need to start preparing? And I would really encourage all business leaders to start taking a hard look at this now, whether you're someone whose use case is going to be farther in the future, or if you have a more near-term use case like optimization. One of the challenges with quantum computing is that it's a very complex area. And to Mark's point about the workforce that will likely be coming out of India, where they're very highly skilled in the STEM areas, to work with the quantum computers need to have a very good understanding of the physics, the math, and the computer programming. So just on the technical side, there's a pretty high bar for being able to write algorithms for these problems and for being able to understand how to translate your problems into algorithms that are friendly for those. So just on the technical side, we know that this is something that takes quite a while to ramp up. And also on the business side, to get back to the first part of your question, it helps to be really thoughtful about how you approach this. So if you're a business leader who's thinking about, all right, I know that I'm in finance and we're already starting to see portfolio optimization taking place at some of my competitors. So this is something I need to think about. If I were a financial leader, what I would be doing right now is first getting a sense of what are the major areas where we're going to see our operations get impacted. So portfolio optimization is a great example. We have Monte Carlo simulations where you're understanding risk, and you can do risk modeling with quantum computers that can outpace classical computers. A very new area that's just emerged today is quantum natural language processing. So you could start to think about where you could apply that to functions like compliance and how you could use that to fight fraud. So the very first thing you should do is get a sense of where will you be impacted, and then start to talk to your leaders, both on the technical side and on the business side. For from the technical side, get an understanding of what systems do you have in place now, and what would you need to start to change to make it friendly for the quantum computing side. And then also talk to your business leaders to understand, all right, if we were to do a proof of concept here, what would be some of those metrics that would let us know this is a really good value for the long run? This is something that can save us money or it can save us time. So understand the technical needs as well as understand how it's going to impact your bottom line. And the last thing I would say is start thinking about your people resources. Quantum computing represents a big change. So you're not only going to need people who can understand the technical side of it, you're going to need people who can champion it. They can really be those thought leaders within your company and help you find those use cases where you can get that advantage. And you're also going to need people on the business side who can act as that middle ground, who can talk to the tech leaders, who can talk to the business leaders, who can help bring everything together. So to wrap it all up, if you're someone who's starting to think about what's the timing for this, I'd really encourage you to start looking into it sooner rather than later. Even if you don't spend $1 this year, just start thinking about it. Start thinking about your roadmaps and where this could impact you, and take a very hard look at your business and see where you think this could give you an advantage, and start pulling in your leadership to talk about that.
Thank you. I have some additional questions prepared, but I would like to encourage anyone with any questions to please type them in the chat now, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can while we're all together today. Anything we don't get to today, you can be sure will be addressed on October 20th during the fireside chat on quantum computing, so phase 2 of this program.
Ivy, may I really quickly add something to what
Yeah,
Danica
please.
said on being a business leader? Also look at this internationally. The talent shortage is real, and you should look at the talent not just in your own country, but internationally, and just keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And I think, Petra, the examples that you gave earlier of the countries that are investing in quantum computing and in talent building, because the investment is not just the cash is going into humans that are developing the skills.
Correct.
And creating the technical capabilities and the machinery to do this, right? Mark, can you talk a little bit more about the commercial use of quantum? Perhaps give us a sense of how quantum in its early stages is being applied right now, and then take us to any thoughts you have about how it will be applied commercially in the coming years or decades, and what's going to happen while most of us are still alive, and what's for our kids and grandkids.
I'm going to regret that phrase. Yeah. So I think if we look at quantum computing now, I mean, there's we had back in the 80s and the 90s the idea that this could actually be something that might actually have a benefit, and then there was a hiatus in the late 90s, early 2000s, where a lot of tech companies went away and started doing their homework and started to think about how can we actually build these qubits. And IBM kind of preempted that back in 2016, 2017, with the launch of their quantum experience, so a publicly available API and toolkits and interfaces and GUIs to access real quantum computers. What that has done is it's created, as I said, this pool of people who've actually had the ability to use a quantum computer. That's not enough, though. And if we look at the overwhelming majority of all the quantum computing technologies that are available today, they all either use some kind of superconducting technology, or they're in kind of photonics, or using trapped ions, all of which require very, very high-end specialist hardware to drive them. And I think what we're seeing now is a transition to a new phase where some of those technologies do actually have the potential to be miniaturizable, to become something that you could put into your perfectly normal commercial compute center. Some of those technologies don't, because the operational expenses, the OPEX, will basically kill you. It will be very, very difficult to operate superconducting quantum computers in a commercial setting the way they're constructed at the moment. And I think the the kind of the holy grail, which everyone is hoping for, is a scalable, cheap way to produce quantum computers that work at room temperature, and that essentially are produced in much the same way as a silicon chip is today. And I'm not going to do any, I'm not going to push it on the advertising the new company I'm working for, but that was the reason I went from IBM to Quantum Brilliance. It's because I saw exactly that as being the game changer. So the ability to write algorithms, a scalable room temperature underlying technology. And then I think what's going to happen is we will see small quantum computers being applied in places, in locations where today perhaps you're using a GPU or a TPU, some kind of accelerator card, or perhaps it's an autonomous robot or an aircraft or something that's under the sea, something that's not connected to any cloud or anything, or in a operational environment in a compute center where costs are paramount, where operational costs are the thing that really determines what you do. And I think small increments in performance applied to those kind of scenarios, that's where we're going to see quantum computing, quantum utility start to become relevant in a very, very short time. And where that leads to over the next decades, who knows? If you'd asked somebody in the 1960s what will we be doing with transistors in 40 years, I think you would have, you probably would have been asked if you'd been smoking something, if you'd know what the answer was.
So Ram from our audience has asked about the influence of quantum computing in value growth companies. He expressed concern that many might not want to risk their requirement on quantum platforms since there are no such case studies. Would anyone like to take that?
So I could take it, but
Please,
what
Mark.
clarification on exactly what that term means. What is meant by that?
Let's see, Ram, if you could weigh in on the chat and share with us, that would be really helpful to clarify. In the meantime, can any of our panelists talk about cryptocurrency? Jeff expressed some concern that cryptocurrency people are seeing that there might be some risk to the cryptocurrency community, and that CBDC by governments might be at risk from quantum. How long do you perceive quantum computing might be a threat to cryptocurrency, if any of you do?
It sounds like one for Frank.
So I've asked this question of crypto experts and didn't quite understand the answer. So if nothing is done, it presents a very serious threat with the ability to do prime factorization. However, there are already people working on this, and there will be some versions of quantum resistant encryption being applied to many of these crypto networks. Now, keep in mind, as cryptocurrency networks have gotten bigger, the larger a system gets, the harder it is to roll out changes. So I would imagine that it's probably best to start today to upgrade all these algorithms. In fact, that's the guidance that you get from the NSA is, start upgrading your algorithms today in order to, given how slow government agencies are known to work, even if it does take 10 years or 20 years to develop a quantum computer capable of breaking this encryption, now's the time to start. The other thing I would add is we had another question about, what are 2 to 3 technical innovations that would explode the field of quantum computing? Basically, I think having it so you could run something at or very close to room temperature, I think is going to be a big game changer. So like Mark said, you're not going to get a cryo tank or liquid nitrogen in your average commercial data center. And the other thing would be error correction. One of the problems that we have is dealing with these qubits is that they are prone to producing errors. Now, we had this problem with electronic circuits too, and it just took some time to really fix the problem or address the problem. So I'm confident that we will address the problem, but it's just a question of, this is something that they don't generally teach in computer science degrees because this problem has been largely solved. In fact, when I was getting my degree, which was longer than I care to admit ago, it was kind of like, yeah, we'll talk about it, but this is not really something, unless you're going to work in a fab lab or whatever, you're not really going to have to deal with this. So it's interesting that this has kind of come full circle. And I think that we really are in that transistor moment, like Mark said, who would have predicted that we would, have smartphones, with multiple times more computing power than the Apollo program had, or all of NASA had. And, we use it to share pictures of cats and argue with strangers, right? I would have assumed, if somebody told me that in the 60s, wasn't alive in the 60s, but if somebody told me back then, I would have assumed that they were on definitely some form of mind altering substance.
So to follow up on that, Ram clarified his question about value companies, value and growth companies. And really what he's asking about is, how do you convince customers to go with quantum computers? How do you get, some might be risk averse to taking the quantum leap.
So I think the question to this is, it's the classic economics or business operations, or the difference between capital expenditure and operational expenditure. That's what it comes down to. Capital expenditure is when you invest in buying some big new thing, and operational expenditure is what you have to spend to run it. Quantum computers at the moment are very, very large capital expenditures. Getting one, building one, buying one is, it's a multi-year, multi-decade research project. And they're complicated to run and big and unwieldy, and you have to fill them up with liquid nitrogen or helium once a week. So they're big on both. The economic argument about when will people actually start to invest and start to buy quantum computers and use them in anger is when that second one drops, so that it's comparable with what people are using already. If you go in a commercial compute center, they have 19-inch racks. These are full of mostly Intel CPUs. There'll be some NVIDIA GPUs in there. There may be some tensor processing units in there, each of them doing what they're good at. And I think very rapidly now we're going to see a future in which there's a QPU, quantum processing unit, a quantum accelerator. And basically the software knows, okay, for certain problems I use my GPU, for other problems I use the CPU, and for a particular class of problems where we know that there's a quantum speed up, quantum utility, I'll send those to the quantum processing unit. And I think we're going to get there in very, very few years, because assuming we can keep the operational expenses down, then Ram's question is very relevant. Then there is absolutely no reason why a normal commercial entity, a company, might say, okay, then it's pretty clear for this particular problem, it's economically very advantageous to buy some QPUs, and then it will happen. And that's a different economic model and a totally different approach to exploring the technology itself, which is what most of the industry is focusing on. And so I don't know if that answers Ram's question. I hope so. To put a number on it, within a handful of years, we're going to see these things in the commercial compute center.
And maybe to add, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I would add is that I think you're going to see, given that we're in the era of the cloud, I think you're going to see just a lot of folks spin up Amazon Bracket or Microsoft Azure Quantum, or IBM has a pretty big quantum offering all in the cloud. So I think that, the whole idea is that you don't have to, buy a quantum computer. You can kind of, just use the cloud model that, would make it much more practical and approachable.
Exactly. I was going to say the exact same point. So there is this private money going into these hardware agnostic emulators and simulators that, the end users, the banks and telecom companies then can use, or they can use Microsoft Azure and IBM's programs.
Thank you, Petra. Mohammed asks, would it be possible for quantum computing to explore scientific breakthroughs like particle physics? He asks, would it not be difficult to make a breakthrough in something that we may not know much about? I'm just wondering on the limitations of quantum computers.
So I'll take a stab at this one. I would say absolutely. I think that the more we understand about subatomic or particle physics, the better we can build quantum computers and understand them. I would say that, you know, you could not have had the transistor had there not been a century or more of exploration into electricity and electromagnetism. I think that the two will help each other. I think there's a good, you know, get better at one, you can use that to get better at the other, and you go back and forth on that. And I think it would create this upward drift of having better understanding of how, you know, it's just like the old thing, you know, the researchers figure out how something is possible and the engineers kind of figure out how to make it work in a practical environment.
Mark, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so there are some in particle physics. So particle physics is about high energies, and particle physics is normally about how the core of an atom behaves. It's about the actions of the strong and weak nuclear forces, interactions at various levels. There are problems in particle physics where quantum computers of various types, I mean, we haven't even talked about the different types of quantum computers. There are quite different flavors, if you will. So there are problems in particle physics where quantum computers look very, very promising in terms of their ability to further our understanding. There are a number of problems in particle physics which are very, very, very hard and likely to remain that way. But I think that's illustrative of a very important point. Quantum computing is not a panacea. It won't solve everything. What it will do is drastically change the landscape of what is trivial to solve and what's not. And many things that today are impossible to solve, impossible to do, will become trivial, but not everything. So you're going to see a change in the landscape of what problems we can solve. The effect for me, other than the being in a deep tech startup where we're working on one of these very promising room temperature technologies, the other thing that always fascinates me is having grown up, or not even grown up, having worked at IBM from the birth of the World Wide Web, seeing what happened with the web firsthand. What's the social, economic, and political impact of quantum computing going to be long term? I find that fascinating, and I'm sure, or I'm optimistic that that's going to be comparable with, or maybe even bigger than what happened with the internet. So, interesting question, but leads to all sorts of even more interesting aspects.
Let's talk about talent for a moment. Danica, can you talk a little bit about how people can move into the quantum computing industry and thrive?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that, Ivy. So to share a bit of background, I worked on moving into the quantum computing space for 5 years. So if you want to move into the space, I absolutely encourage you to do that. What I would say that one of the first things you need to have is a very strong why. So for me, it was all about quantum mechanics. I started learning about quantum mechanics in about 2016 and just was fascinated by them. Studied that on my own for a couple of years. In 2018, that's when I decided I really wanted to be strategic about moving into this space. And so I started taking steps towards doing that. And when I look back on my journey, and as I think about the community that's growing now, the most impactful thing that you could possibly do for yourself is to network. So if you're here at an event like this, that's fantastic. And if you see someone in the audience who's asked an interesting question and maybe you want to connect with them to learn more about that, I'd really encourage you to reach out to them on LinkedIn. Or if there's a panelist or a moderator or a host who's bringing up interesting points, then again, reach out to them on LinkedIn and see if they'd be open to having a conversation with you, because this space is very small and incredibly well connected. So to share some insight there, Petra and I met at a networking event, I believe it was last year. And Frank and I had the privilege of meeting earlier this year, and that's part of how this came together. So the first thing would be network, network and get to know people in this space. Know what your why is, because it may take a while to get to where you want to go. And like any adventure, there's going to be problems that you just can't anticipate, and you're going to need to find a way to work around them. And then the third thing that I would say is to be very open to the possibilities. So currently I'm in a role for Cambridge Quantum where I'm in business development. And prior to that, I was working in compliance at a fintech firm. I never saw myself in a business development role until a gentleman who worked for Cambridge Quantum reached out and said, I think you'd be a good fit for this role. What do you think? Likewise, for the Quantum Strategy Institute, I was approached by the leader of that, and he said, I think that you're a generalist who has a good understanding of business and quantum. What do you think of taking on this role? So as you move through the space and as you network with people and as you talk with people and as you really figure out what drives you, be open to the possibilities, because I'm willing to bet that with the pace that things are growing and with the growing need that we're seeing for all kinds of skill sets, that someone may see a skill set in you that you haven't recognized yet yourself. And if you're willing to be open to that, it'll really help take you far.
Thank you. Petra, how about you? How did you get involved in quantum computing in the first place and why? What drew you to it?
Yeah, my drivers are like on a higher level, the dynamics between countries and public investments, who is doing it and why. I saw there was a question about China in the chat as well. And one of the things that is interesting in this space is because it's related to national security. It's also a hot topic, so it's a buzzword. It's easy to put out press releases and kind of stir a pot in that way. So the specific question on China's communication, quantum communication press release, it was a good conversation opening, not necessarily anything that China is doing differently than any other country, US or the European Union is doing. However, I think what the US is doing is where the national labs are now working on the quantum information systems, frameworks, protocols, and standards. It is public knowledge that NSA does not embrace post-quantum crypto, but private companies with public money in this country are doing exactly the same things. So this was kind of the dynamic of all of this was my driver.
Great. Frank, what got you into quantum computing in the first place and why?
So it's a funny story. I was at this conference Microsoft throws for internally called MLADS, and SEP, you should totally go when you get a chance. But basically, it's Microsoft Research throws this twice a year, this conference where researchers kind of share what they're working on, and the idea is to get some cross-pollination. So I attended, and I was just the second day keynote was all going to be all about hardware, and I was kind of a little annoyed, to be honest, that why are we at an AI conference and we're talking about servers and things like that. But I'm glad I didn't get out of the room, because the head of Azure Quantum came up and explained what quantum computing was, and I had heard of it, but specifically what it could do for route optimization and optimization problems in AI and ML. And that's when my head exploded with the possibilities. And there was some more kind of conversation about that, some of which is, not necessarily public knowledge, but it was just fascinating that this was possible. So I was so excited and so jazzed about this. I went back to my hotel and I installed the Q# developer kit. And then I looked at it and I was like, well, now what, because the developing in a quantum system is not the same as, you just pull up a book on Python, or it's a different type of way of thinking. And that's what got me inspired, was kind of like, wow, this is the first time in a long time that I opened up a computer system and literally had no idea what I was doing. And at first I was a little bit alarmed at that. And then I realized, wait, this is the challenge of, I haven't faced in, again, a lot longer than I care to admit, but it's just fascinating that because you have these different quantum states, there's all sorts of, logic gates that are possible that just don't exist in conventional computing. And, I don't want to bore people with kind of like the fundamentals of that. And like, honestly, Kurt Cobain was still alive when I was studying this. So like it's one of those things where it's like, wow, this really takes me back. And like, this is the new frontier. So that's what got me into it.
Thank you. Mark, how did you get into quantum computing in the first place and why?
So I think it started on the 21st of July, 1969. Yes. Everybody's
Very
thinking what
specific.
happened on. Yeah,
Day
very
before-
specific.
Day after the moon landing, right?
Right. That was the day after the moon landing. So I was in the UK, and I was a 7-year-old boy, and my father had woke me up in the middle of the night and said, "Come on, we're going to go and watch this." And I asked him, how did that all happen? How can I, I'd like to do it. Like to understand how that happened, Daddy. And the next day he handed me a soldering iron and a box of components and said, "Okay, build yourself a radio." And that was where my obsession with engineering, with electronic engineering, began. So that led me to study computer science, electronic engineering, applied physics, and I did a PhD in information theory. Fast forward 25 years later, almost 25 years later, or 30 years later, I was working at IBM, and I had a very unusual set of qualifications, combined with over 30 years direct business experience. And IBM said to me, "Listen, we're now going to go public and begin to explore how quantum computing is going to impact the marketplace, and we need people like you to transport that message, because nobody else is going to be able to do it right now." So that's how I got into quantum computing, or back into quantum computing. When I did my PhD, the very first qubits had been invented. But I wanted to also just pick up on a point you just made, Frank, which was there is a gap. There is a gap between people who understand how to use quantum computers and really how to use them and how to write new algorithms. And I would say, the PhD in quantum information science or quantum physics is probably a prerequisite. And the people who just are interested in using them. So two different things, it's walking the path or being told what it's like to walk the path, or reading a book and being able to write a book. We still haven't overcome that gap. There's still a lot of work to be done. But I think that's something that, particularly the people in the call today, and particularly for the other panelists, we already talked about the skills gap. We talked about talent. There is so much potential and so much pull from the market. Anybody who's even remotely interested in quantum computing, it's a very, very good future, a very good investment in your own future. Encourage everyone to get involved.
We only have time for a few more minutes and on the program. So I want to see if we can get one or two more questions in. Petra, can we get back to funding a little bit? We've just had this very elaborate conversation about the potential of quantum computing, about what lies in the future, which governments and countries are involved in funding, some of the larger public companies. Perhaps you could shed light on some of the private funding as well, and talk a little bit about what are we funding?
Okay, the last question was very difficult, but I would like to start with an event that happened a couple of weeks ago that to the technical people in this call probably is equivalent to reaching the quantum supremacy, which in the business world was the IPO of IonQ. So the fact that we have a quantum company that is now a publicly traded company is a huge milestone in this industry. And I think finally we can call it an industry, because not so long ago, it was just a scientific research field, and now it's a real industry. Now, before that, there was the acquisition of Honeywell acquired IonQ, and then Rigetti announced within the past week that they're going to do a SPAC deal. And if you put all of this money together, the Honeywell deal, the IonQ and the Rigetti deal, what they have announced is total $1 billion in investment in 3 companies only within the past weeks or months. So that's a huge chunk of money that just went into these 3 companies. Now, last year, there was about $1 billion private VC investments into startups and a bit more mature quantum technology companies. but so how these companies are going to make money, that's a really interesting question. So there's a lot of money around, and a lot of people are afraid that we're going towards that .com boom, that there's too much hype and that there might be a crash at some point. So that's something that we need to be mindful of. Currently, if you look at the funded the funded startups, what they're doing is they're producing products and services that are being sold to research teams. So they are doing the emulators, the cloud services that we talked about, and instruments for labs and so forth. So basically, we're in a cycle where any exit would be an acquisition by these larger companies.
So obviously, this conversation is just scratching the surface. There's so much more to cover off on. I really encourage everyone to attend the fireside chat next week. Lauren, did you want to take a handoff?
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for our sponsors. This was a great panel. Yes, Mark is just like Morpheus. If anyone has questions for Morpheus, he's there next week, 4 o'clock. I'll be putting up the next meetup later tonight. So I didn't want to do back to back, but it'll be up tonight. And thank you, everyone. Oh, and Sebastian, someone's asking you, red or blue? Which one are you taking?
Well, red, definitely.
Okay.
And I've even got this thing here.
Yeah.
The gap in my teeth.
And same haircut.
Yes.
Thank you,
Same
everyone.
haircut.
See you next week.
Thanks.
Thank
Great
you.
panel, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.